get this thing. There you go. It says hit recording in progress. Oh, I didn't hear it. Now I'm gonna leave this thing. This should go away, and that should kind of. This will stay, maybe, but the whole panel should go. Like you see it. We've got 9.
If if Rick doesn't come, you can just depend on you. Okay. Oh, I can introduce myself. Water. I'm gonna run up and get some more water. Okay. Okay.
About ready?
Mm-hmm.
Good afternoon. I guess we'll go ahead and get started. You good? Thank you for coming. Muters, you are, Zoomers, I mean, people on Zoom, you are muted. Please stay muted. At the end, if you have questions for Barbara, you can put them in the chat and I'll monitor the chat. If you have a cell phone, could you please silence it? Would be greatly appreciated. So I don't see my facilitator here, but I'm just going to go say we are going to have a very special treat for today. Barbara Oberlander is going to tell us today about the women on the quarters. There you go.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? It sounds very loud to me, so if it's too loud, do let me know. No, I don't think so. Okay, thank you. Several years ago, a friend of mine who lives at Ocamic, I think it was actually June Gerard, who will be known to many of you, said to me, I just saw an announcement that the US Mint is going to change the quarter design and put out several new faces on the quarters, which will honor women. And she showed me the article and I said, oh, that's interesting, and put it in some file, which I can no longer find. I was too focused at that time on the Harriet Tubman $20 bill, which of course still has not come out, and we do hope it will come out. But my son-in-law gave me a set of the first issuing of the Women on the Quarters, which began in 2022 and continues through 2025, and it piqued my interest. So yes, indeed, the US Mint has a program that's been going on now for 4 years. Each year they issue 5 quarters honoring women. Oh, it's not. Okay. Okay. So here's the history of the program. 4-year program featuring the accomplishments and contributions made by women of the United States. The Secretary of the Treasury selects who will be honored following consultation with the Smithsonian, their Special American Women's History Initiative, the National Women's History Museum, the Congressional Bipartisan Women's Caucus. And in 2021, the public was invited to submit recommendations for potential honorees. The idea was to honor women from a variety of different ethnic backgrounds and a variety of different fields. So you can see on this one, we have Ida B. Wells, who was a civil rights activist. We have Dr. Vera Rubin, who was an astronomist who I had not heard of. People you will know, Althea Gibson, Stacey Park Milburn, who was someone who pushed disability rights, and Juliette Gordon-Low, who I'll talk about in the very last week. And I was fascinated by the choices. There are indeed women of Native American background. There are indeed women of Hispanic background. There are white women. There are African American women. There's a Hawaiian woman. But some of the choices surprise me. For example, Eleanor Roosevelt is one of the choices, and she's been honored so much that I was kind of shocked to see her having a quarter. The way you can tell if you have any of these new quarters, and until I've been telling friends about this, nobody was aware of it really, is to look at your quarter collection, and if George Washington is facing to the right instead of the left, on the back, you will find a woman. And the reason for this is that this was a design that was done in 1932, but it was not used at that time. And so they are using it now for the women on the quarters. The person I'm going to talk about today, Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, is the only female Medal of Honor recipient ever in American history. But she wasn't just that. As you will see, she was a doctor during the Civil War. She was interested in all kinds of reform, including the suffrage, dress reform. She campaigned against alcohol and tobacco. And she was not one to keep quiet. She is definitely an interesting, incredible, accomplished, unique woman who in her lifetime was often ridiculed. She was born at the end of November in 1832 in Oswego, New York. Her parents, Alva and Vesta Walker, had 6 children. They were a free-thinking couple. So although they were very religious, they encouraged all the daughters in their family to get educated. They encouraged them to wear comfortable clothes around the farm. And comfortable clothes did not mean skirts, as you will see. And one writer has described them as kind of a hippie couple. The names of 2 of their daughters were Luna and Aurora Borealis. So if that tells you something. The father built the first free school in Oswego. And when the county started their own school, he converted it essentially into a mechanic shop, and he made doors and coffins and other things. But he was also interested in medicine, so he became a self-taught country doctor. And there were a lot of books on medicine in the house where Mary grew up. She attended the local common school and a seminary in New York for 2 winter terms. And here she is as a young girl. Notice the outfit. Very early on, she took to wearing trousers with a long dress over them for comfort. But she wanted to go to medical school. Now, at this time, you could count the number of female doctors in the country on one hand. Of course, Elizabeth Blackwell had gone to Geneva Medical College, the first woman in this country actually to be trained as a doctor. But after Elizabeth Blackwell went through Geneva Medical College, thought better of it, and didn't take women for a very long time. However, Mary Walker did go to medical school. She went to Syracuse Medical College, which at that time was an eclectic kind of medical school. She took several 13-week semesters and graduated in 1855 with 12 other students. She graduated with honors. It cost, by the way, $55 a semester. Medical schools have come a long way in terms of their charges. And when she got married in 1855, and she did get married to a fellow medical student, and the marriage, by the way, only lasted a very short time, she adopted this kind of dress. Amelia Bloomer had made this famous in the 1850s. It was the idea of almost Turkish-like pantaloons with a long dress over them. And evidently, that's what Mary Walker wore to her wedding. She refused to use the word obey in the vows, and she insisted on keeping a hyphenated name, Mary Walker Miller. As I said, the marriage did not last very long, and she attempted to establish really her own medical practice once she had separated from her husband. But many people at that time were somewhat squeamish about the idea of going to a female doctor. It did not seem proper. And so she struggled really to make a living as a doctor. But when the Civil War broke out in 1861, she knew what she wanted to do. She wanted to offer her medical training to the US forces, and she went to Washington to seek a formal appointment with the Union Army as an Army surgeon. But she was not approved. Partially, of course, because she was a woman, and partially because her training had, as I said, been somewhat eclectic. So she decided to work as an unpaid volunteer. Women are familiar with that role, aren't we? Unpaid volunteer. And it was the US Patent Office, which was converted into a makeshift hospital called Indiana during the Civil War. And that's where she started out. She also helped to set up a women's relief association to take care of all the women who were coming into the Washington area, essentially following their husbands who were involved in military service. She continued her work, and she also continued her studies. And as I said, she liked different approaches. And so she went to this college, the Hygiotherapeutic College of New York, where she studied water cures, botany, different ways of approaching germs and disease. Then in the fall of 1862, she decided to go into the battle zone. And she went into the battle zone around Virginia. And what can I say? Some of the fiercest fighting in the Civil War in 1862 and 1863 was in the Virginia area. And she was giving assistance at the makeshift hospitals that were sent up very rapidly. I'm sure you all know that the casualties in the Civil War dwarf anything else. And because medical training was so primitive, doctors really didn't know how to deal with bad wounds. And everything you've heard about medicine in the Civil War is true. Here's another illustration of the battle. You know, we're not accustomed to this kind of close combat today. The method of choice for most bad injuries was amputations. You've all seen movies of veterans coming back from the Civil War, missing an arm or missing a leg, because essentially the doctors didn't know how to treat those wounds. Well, Mary Walker wasn't happy with that. And she felt it was her duty to tell soldiers that they didn't have to agree to amputations and that there were other methods. These were the kind of ambulances that carried wounded soldiers away from the battlefield. You can see how primitive it was. She would serve throughout some of these horrendous battles, 1862, 1863, as I said. And in the field, what did she wear? She put together a uniform. There's no doubt that it's military, but as you can see, she is wearing pants. And it made sense. Think about being in a tent with wounded soldiers in long skirts, sweeping up the dust and the germs and the blood. Talk about unsanitary. Clearly, this was the way to go. She was ridiculed for it, but she persisted. In 1864, after she had finally been appointed as a, quote, contract acting assistant surgeon, unquote. That's a civilian title. She never got a military appointment. She had been assigned to the Army of the Cumberland and then to the 52nd Ohio. She kept petitioning and petitioning. She wrote directly to President Lincoln and other people for a military appointment, but it never happened. And she often crossed military lines, Union and Confederate lines, to care for wounded soldiers. She didn't care which side they were on. And she was also caring for wounded civilians. And of course, she was dressed in the outfit you saw. So in the summer of 1864, she was in Confederate territory. They took one look at a woman dressed in man's trousers, figured she was a spy, and she was captured and arrested and confined to this military prison in Richmond, Virginia. There was a tremendous amount of publicity about her when she arrived at this military prison, because the Confederate guards and soldiers didn't know what to make of this woman who was wearing trousers. And if you look at Confederate diaries and letters that were written, they said things like, quote, she was dressed in the full uniform of a federal surgeon, not good looking, and of course had a tongue enough for a regiment of men. The crowd was amused and disgusted at the sight of a thing that nothing but the debased and deprived Yankee nation could produce. So that's how they regarded her. And there was a report in the Richmond newspaper that she was wearing men's clothes. So there's Castle Thunder, another view. She wrote to the Richmond paper, "Sir, will you please correct the statement you made this morning in the dispatch in regard to my being dressed in male attire? As such is not the case, simple justice demands correction. I am attired in what is usually called the bloomer, a reform dress, which is similar to other ladies with the exception of it being shorter and more physiological than long dresses." Can you imagine? She wrote this to the Richmond newspaper while she was a prisoner in a Confederate place, simply trying to correct them on their view of what she was wearing. She was released after 4 months in August of 1864, and she was exchanged for a surgeon, and she was very proud of that. And when she was released, President Lincoln wanted to meet with her to hear what her experience was. So Mary Walker actually met with Abraham Lincoln, and she talked about her experience. Actually, despite the letters she wrote home to her mother saying everything was okay, those are the letters we all write, right? Everything's okay. She had a hard time in prison. The conditions were very bad. The food was not good. Her health suffered, and it would have a permanent impact on the rest of her life. But Lincoln wanted to know about the actual treatment, and she told him, and she also said, I want a military appointment. I want to be recognized as part of the military. I would like to be appointed to the rank of major. And Lincoln replied that he could not interfere in that kind of decision. So she took up her pen and she wrote to a colonel. This is the fall of 1864. I am sure you will not refuse the favor I'm about to ask, that you take this in person to the president without delay and get the confirmation of my rank of major. I told the president of the risks I encountered in being taken prisoner on purpose and preventing their attacking our army. And then she goes on to talk about following the instructions and getting information to General Grant and all of that. And she ends by saying, think of Sheridan's success. Remember that I suffered so willingly for months. I do not hesitate to grant the favor. And after getting the president's confirmation, please send it to me at Oswego, New York. So she was very anxious to get that military rank of major, but it did not happen. And here is a photograph taken of her at this time. You can see the outfit. Now, the Medal of Honor. It was first authorized by Abraham Lincoln in 1861 for sailors and Marines during the Civil War. And the following year, he authorized 2,000 medals for soldiers. The medal was created to recognize enlisted personnel who distinguished themselves through gallantry and other soldier-like qualities. The actual medal that Mary Walker will be given is shown on the left of this photograph. Her Medal of Honor was given by President Andrew Johnson. Whereas it appears from official reports that Mary Walker, a graduate of medicine, quote, has rendered valuable service to the government, and her efforts have been earnest and untiring in a variety of ways. Assigned to duty, served as an assistant surgeon in charge of female prisoners at Louisville, Kentucky, which she did after the Civil War. Upon the recommendation of Major General Sherman and Thomas, and faithfully served as contract surgeon, there's the words, in the service of the U.S., and has devoted herself with much patriotic zeal to the sick and wounded, both in the field and hospitals, to the detriment of her own health, has endured hardships as a prisoner of war for 4 months in a southern prison while acting as contract surgeon. And here's the important part, whereas by reason of her not being a commissioned officer in the military service, a brevet or honorary rank cannot, under existing laws, be conferred upon her. And whereas in the opinion of the president, an honorable recognition of her services and suffering should be made, it is ordered that said Mary Walker given the usual Medal of Honor for meritorious services, November 1865. So Mary Walker was among the first group ever to get the Medal of Honor. But in 1917, the military decided to review who had gotten the Medal of Honor. And they decided that 900 people shouldn't have gotten the Medal of Honor. Here she is, wearing it proudly, by the way. She never took it off. These are wonderful photographs by Matthew Brady, the Civil War photographer. Now, one of the 900 people was Buffalo Bill Cody, and they decided that his Medal of Honor should be taken away, and it was given back to him finally in 1989. Mary Walker's medal was also taken away in 1917. As I said, she would not take it off. She did not give it back. She would die 2 years later, and she was still wearing that Medal of Honor. But there was a big effort to reinstate the Medal of Honor, and it happened in 1977. It was President Jimmy Carter who reinstated her medal, stating her, quote, distinguished gallantry, self-sacrifice, patriotism, dedication, unflinching loyalty to her country, despite the apparent discrimination because of her sex. So there you have it. That's the story on her Medal of Honor. Now, what did she do after the Civil War? She, as we'll see, she became an activist. She went on a lecture tour. Here she is with a Medal of Honor. And she went to Britain, and she had her photograph taken in London during this time. And you can see these wonderful photographs. What she talked about on these lecture tours was healthcare, temperance, women's rights, and dress reform. She had long advocated for this, for healthy dress for women that allowed freedom of action for their bodies. And she talked about it as not a matter of fashion, but as a matter of health. She was often criticized and ridiculed herself and arrested for wearing male clothes. That happened once in New Orleans. And when she was brought before the judge, she said, I have a right to dress as I please. This is free America. And I served 4 years in the cause of freedom. And the judge dismissed all charges against her. Now you can see by 1870, the curls are gone. And this is what she said about dress reform. The greatest sorrows from which women suffer today are those physical, moral, and mental ones that are caused by their unhygienic manner of dressing. The want of the ballad is but a toy by comparison. Well, the women who were working for suffrage would have disagreed with that, but there's no doubt that the 19th century matter of dress for women was not good for their health. Do you all remember Gone with the Wind and Scarlet being laced into these corsets to have this tiny, tiny waist? You could hardly breathe. Remember how women were always fainting away? Well, this is a good reason for it. Look at this. The tiny waist and up to 8 petticoats underneath layers of material. Women were carrying around 15 to 20 pounds of material. And Mary Walker thought this was absolutely unhealthy and damaging to women. And she said that was the case. These petticoats collect dirt, dust, they cause discomfort, they inhibit mobility. Think about what women have to endure. And she said that dress, quote, should protect the person and allow freedom of motion and circulation, not make the wearer a slave to the dress. And so she was passionate about this, really passionate about the dress reform. And dress reform was one of the topics in a book that she published. It's called HIT, Essays on Women's Rights. If you're wondering why that's the title, the answer is nobody knows. We do not understand what HIT means. Was she trying to hit people with facts, hit them with causes? We have no explanation for it. And it's kind of a rambling collection of essays on various reforms, including a huge chapter on dress reform. And she even went so far to say that the current dress made young women unfit for marriage and childbearing because their organs were being so compressed by the clothing they were wearing. And she had a proposal for underwear, and here it is. This was her proposal for a reform undersuit that women should wear instead of what they were currently wearing. Here she is in the 1870s. And 1881, this has to do with her position on women's suffrage, this article. She was absolutely in favor of women having the right to vote, but she was against a federal amendment because she believed women already had the right to vote under the Constitution. And she actually had tried to vote herself and been refused, but she thought a federal amendment was the wrong way to go, that women's rights should simply be recognized under the Constitution. 1887, still got that Medal of Honor on. And this is an incredible photograph of her with Belva Lockwood. The name might sound familiar to you. She was a lawyer, a progressive lawyer in the 19th century who was the first woman to argue a case before the Supreme Court. She was also the woman who helped Mary Todd Lincoln when she was committed to an insane asylum. And she ran for president on an equality ticket. So these two make a perfect couple, I think. And here you have a wonderful picture of Mary Walker. And by this time, she had adopted a full men's dress. She went to Washington to lobby. And there she is, supposedly talking to politicians about women's suffrage and other issues. And she is featured in this cartoon that appeared in the humor periodical Puck. There was an upcoming Buffalo Exposition, the Pan American Exposition, a World's Fair that was going to be held in Buffalo. And Puck said it was going to have a chamber of female horrors, unquote. feminists, suffragists, and temperance leaders of the time were satirized. So what you're looking at here, the women who are pictured, you've got Susan B. Anthony, you've got Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and on the far left, in top hat and men's dress, you've got Mary Walker. She continued to come to Washington as long as she could. This is her again. And this is amusing. There was a New York State Fair in 1911. I'm sorry, the reproduction isn't any better, but you know what she's wearing by this time. And she won the prize for Best Dressed Woman at the New York State Fair. And her comment was, that means that every woman will want to dress as I do in a Prince Albert jacket and slacks. 1912, again, in Washington. She fell at the Capitol in 1917 and died 2 years later. Now, Mary Walker has been recognized in various ways. You might be surprised to know that there was a Liberty ship named after her during World War II, and you can see this is a commemoration of that. Stamps recognizing her Medal of Honor. This was 1982. Stamps cost 20 cents. The State University of New York dedicated a health center to her. It's called the Mary Walker Health Center. And this one really interested me. I don't know if any of you are aware of this. There is a clinic in Washington, D.C. called the Whitman Walker Health Clinic. It was started during the AIDS epidemic. And they named it after Walt Whitman because they said he lived his life among men, and also Mary Walker because she wasn't afraid to be a doctor and dress as she wanted. And that was the clinic when it was started. It has moved to much fancier headquarters recently, but it is still going. In 2011, a statue was dedicated in front of the Oswego Town Hall in New York. This statue, by the way, weighs about 900 pounds. It was sculpted by a local artist, and it shows her at a lectern wearing trousers beneath the calf-length skirt. Of course, there were books. I was amused by the fact that the book of Gutsy Women, written by Hillary Rodham Clinton and her daughter Chelsea, includes Mary Walker. Yes, she was a gutsy woman. A very good biography of her is I Could Not Do Otherwise by Sarah Latta. And a military fort was renamed after her just a few years ago. A few years ago, there was an effort to change the names of forts that honored Confederate generals and rename them in a more appropriate way. And Fort Hill in Virginia was renamed Fort Walker. This is the plaque that was there. And you know most of the information, but I was struck by the very last sentence. Dr. Mary Walker represents the great skill, vision, and courage of many women who have served the U.S. Her determination toward service, equality, and care for the wounded remain core values of the United States Army and the nation. A lovely tribute to her. And there's a blown up look at the quarter that she's on. And you'll notice that it highlights the Medal of Honor, and it shows her wearing that Medal of Honor. And of course, her quotes. The recognition of the individuality of women is simply an acknowledgement of human rights, which all human beings have guaranteed them by the fact of their having an existence. We must not wait for others to create change. We must have the audacity to be the change. No one knows or will ever know what it has cost me to live up to my principles, to be consistent with my convictions and declarations. But I have done it, and I'm not sorry for it. Now, just this past month, some of you may know about this. A National Medal of Honor museum was built and dedicated in Arlington, Texas. So of course, I had to go on and see whether Mary Walker was listed, and she is listed. There are approximately 3,400 people who have won the Medal of Honor in the United States. It's the highest military honor to be awarded. It's presented by the president in the name of Congress. And here are the qualifications for those of you who are interested in such things. It's for people who distinguish themselves while engaged in action against an enemy, engaged in military operations, serving with friendly foreign forces, et cetera, et cetera. There are now 3 distinct versions: Army, Navy, and Air Force. Now look at the statistics. 3,500 honorees as of March 2025. Since the Revolutionary War, 3 million women have served in the US military, 24 million men. Women are now the fastest growing group of veterans, projected to make up 18% of all veterans by 2040. So I was trying to figure this out proportionally. If 24 million men have served and 3 million women have served, and there are 3,500 honorees, shouldn't there be more than one woman who has ever received the Medal of Honor? It's kind of shocking when you look at it. And so I end with Mary Walker's quote: "Let the generations know that women in uniform also guaranteed their freedom." Thank you, Mary Walker, and thank you for listening. See if I have any questions.
Okay, questions? I'll walk around with the mic. Anybody have any questions for Barbara? Wow, amazing.
Barbara, thank you. That was wonderful and information that I think not any of us knew before. I'm wondering how adamant an abolitionist she was. She was all for women's suffrage and for, you know, honor in the military, but was she vocal about abolition?
The family was abolitionist. She was brought up with those views, but that wasn't her major cause. Yeah, you would have thought it might have been, particularly in New York, because that area was a hotbed of abolitionist feeling. But yeah, when people write about her, they don't emphasize that. They emphasize the dress reform and the suffrage and the health reform and against tobacco and alcohol and all of that, but not abolitionism. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so of that 3 million women that you indicated have been documented, it seemed, I had read recently that as recent as even the Vietnam War, women who had served in, say, the military side of things didn't see frontline action, would come home and their compatriots would basically say, oh, well, you didn't serve in the military.
Right.
So is that 3 million including all of those people, or have we not even been able to document them?
Oh, no, we've included them.
Okay.
We've included that. I mean, the people who were, for example, nurses connected to the Army or the Navy or whatever, they're included as veterans. And, you know, there is a women's memorial in Washington, but the specifications for the Medal of Honor are very narrow. As you could see, maybe I went by them too quickly. I mean, you're supposed to be in actual combat. Well, you know, you're a nurse in a field station and a bomb falls on the field station. Are we going to quibble about whether you're in combat or not? You may not be carrying a weapon. I mean, from myself, after reading all this material, I'm amazed that there haven't been any other women given the Medal of Honor. I read that there was an effort a couple of years ago on the part of a congressman out west, but it didn't happen. You have to be nominated either by the people in the chain of command or a member of Congress.
I have a question about the nominations. Are there records of women that have been nominated and they have been turned down?
Oh, that's a good question. And I don't know the answer to that. Whether women have been nominated and turned down. Actually, that's a very good question. I'll have to look it up immediately.
Yeah, you mentioned early in your talk her concern about amputation. And
Yes.
she did preliminary research about alternatives. And that was the end of that topic. And I am wondering, did she do more research? Did she find alternatives to amputation? Was there anything that moved
You
that?
don't see a research paper, Turner, but what she was saying was that instead of amputation, you could treat the wound. However, considering the circumstances of the Civil War, it was much more effort to treat the wound than to cut the limb. You know, the medical care is amazingly primitive in the Civil War. More soldiers died of disease in camp than in battle wounds. We recently increased the number we think died in the Civil War from 600,000 to close to 700,000. And you have to add in all of America's wars to get that total. It was like 2% of the population. Think what 2% of the population would be today. But I think for many of the, quote, doctors who were on hand, on the scene in the Civil War, and you have all these people coming in with wounds, the easiest thing is to amputate.
Any other questions? Zoomers, I didn't see any questions from you. Let me just double check one more time. No? Okay, well, thank you very much, Barbara. I think it was great.